The current handbook is so much shorter than the previous 2 handbooks, but it's also just a lot more doctrinal and principle based. You know, the first few chapters, I would hope every member of the church, not just leaders, read, that sets up the purpose of the church, the purpose of families and the relationship there. And then it gets into some of the more specifics. But one thing that Elder Dubé, he used to explain it to leaders this way. He'd say, you have total freedom within this box. And he said, now this box is bound on the one side by scriptures. It's bound by the general handbook, and it's bound by direction from your leaders. But within there, you've got total freedom. As long as the handbook doesn't tell you not to do something, as long as your leaders will approve it, as long as it's not in conflict with the scriptures, you've got freedom to organize it how you need to. So you can read through the handbook and you can see there's a lot of flexibility, a lot more than people think they really have.
Larry Richman, welcome to the Leading Saints podcast.
Thank you.
So
Good to be here, Kurt.
We've known each other for several years, and and you've had some cool roles at the church that I think a lot of church members, they just magically these handbooks come out of the church,
It just happens.
This curriculum or the ministering program. But there's people like yourself behind the scenes making it all happen. So how do you describe your career?
How do I describe my career? It's been varied a bit. It really started on my mission. I was called to the Guatemala El Salvador mission, and I learned Spanish in the MTC, which, LTM it was called at that point. That's how far back it goes. And after 4 months there speaking Spanish, I was called into a program to learn one of the native Indian languages in Guatemala, Cachiquel. So things sort of changed, and they brought down a professor from BYU, Robert Blair, to basically teach us how to learn a language from the people. He brought us down a textbook and gave us some pointers for a few weeks and said, good luck.
Because there wasn't a dictionary, an English Cachiquel dictionary.
There were no dictionaries. There was one grammar that he had written years before.
So he knew this
He knew the language.
Okay.
And he brought in a bunch of members there, and we had a 2-week crash course in how do you pronounce things, and mostly how do you listen to people and how do you learn from them.
Wow. Did it sound anything like Spanish?
No, it's completely different.
Oh, wow.
It has a different root. Spanish is a Latin language, and these are
so
native
you're starting
Mayan
over.
languages. Kind of starting over. But it was really fun. And so my reason for bringing that up is that kind of led to interactions with the church. Nothing had been translated into Cachiquel church materials up until that point. So the last few months of our mission, me and a couple of other elders were called to prepare the missionary discussions and the Joseph Smith pamphlet. And so when I went back home afterwards, they hired me during the summers to help continue that work.
Oh, wow.
And so I went back to Guatemala a couple of summers after that and began working for the church part-time in translation work.
Do they still teach the gospel in this language? Or?
They do. It's a real interesting social economic kind of issue there. A kind of a clash of cultures. The Latin race who speak Spanish versus the native Indians there who speak Cachiquel or Quiche or Quechua or one of the other 17 or so languages.
Wow, fascinating.
That we've dealt with. So I began working for the church as a translator. And so for the next several summers, went back to Guatemala and worked while I was going to BYU part-time.
Cool.
And that kind of led to my introduction in the church, of me even thinking, well, do I want to work for the church?
And how did you how did your career progress through the church? Did you work in different departments?
I did. I bounced around a bit. I started working actually not even in the translation department, but with materials management, helping with the printing and distribution of church materials. And then I ended up in the translation department and eventually the curriculum department, which was later merged with the priesthood and family department. So I've been involved with the production of church materials and helping with the development of church programs basically my whole career.
Yeah. Wow. And then how many years were you in the family and priesthood department?
About the last 15 or so years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then you recently went on a mission to South Africa.
I did.
And came back and started a new mission in the priesthood department.
I did. Yeah. I retired in May of 22, and my wife and I immediately went on a mission. My last day of work was a Friday, and the next Monday morning, my wife and I were in the MTC.
Oh, wow.
Headed to South Africa.
That's cool.
So we were there a year and a half and came back, and now I'm a church service missionary working with some of the same people.
Cool.
On special projects.
And there's
part-time.
all sorts of church service missionaries throughout the corporation of the church, right? Like,
church offices, there are lots of church missionaries, not nearly as many as they need.
Oh, yeah.
But
so is that a call out that we need some?
That's a call out.
Yeah.
And people don't think of it very much. You can serve as a senior missionary at age 40 and on. In fact, if you're single, you can be a church service missionary at age 26. The church needs lots of missionaries. So it's not just a thing to think about once you retire. You can serve part-time from home before you retire, or full-time after you retire, whether it's away from home or at home. A lot of people think, well, I can't serve a mission because my family or my economic or my situation or my health situation precludes. Well, you can serve from home in hundreds of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool, the different opportunities they put out there to make it easy for you, right?
In fact, when we were in the MTC, about half of our district was going to the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii. And they were going to be seamstresses with costumes, or one couple they were assigned to the ukulele experience to teach visitors how to play the ukulele.
Oh,
Others ran the gift shop. But if a person has any idea that they want to go on a mission, they should go to seniormissionary.churchofjesuschrist.org and just look at the possibilities.
Yeah, that's cool.
We had one couple that they were farmers, and they were assigned to church ranches. And so they went on their mission after they retired in their RV. And they would go from one church farm or ranch to the next.
That's cool.
And just doing different things at church ranches. But
it's
amazing the opportunities that are out there.
Nice. So, like, having your career in the church, did you imagine, like, as you're a few years into it, you'd spend your full
Not
career there? Or there's always maybe 5 more years or 3 more years?
I was in graduate school at the time, and I had been studying instructional science. It was called at that time. Nowadays they call it instructional technology. But my idea was to get into language learning programs, go into business to do that. And I was offered the full-time position with the church right in the middle of grad school. And I just knew it was the right thing to do. So I finished that up as quickly as I could and started working for the church.
Yeah.
And so it ended up, in project management kinds of responsibilities. And then I was with the translation department for 5 or 8 years, something like that. And then ended up again in project management, product management, program management, just helping the church implement different kinds of projects.
Now, and with projects and efforts that the church is working on, like, what are some misconceptions that maybe the general membership has, or what's a peek behind the curtain a little bit as far as just understanding what goes on behind the scenes that, that ends up just sort of our Sunday experience or our church experience?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because the priesthood and family department is responsible for those kinds of things. The Sunday experience, the during the week experience, the church organizations, Elders Quorum, Relief Society, primary, Sunday school, young men, young women. So any church program that happens on Sunday or during the week, or curriculum that comes out, magazines, leadership, training, those kinds of things are done by the priesthood and family department. Most things that get implemented are very, very well studied. The church is, we like to often would say this, it's like a big cruise ship. It's not going to turn on a dime. It's going to stay the course. And that's the way the Lord wants it. The church doesn't flip this way and flip that way and change back and forth, but it's little course corrections.
Yeah.
But it's also really interesting to see how that happens, and usually can't see that until afterwards, how the Lord carefully orchestrated what happened, the sequence of things. So there were many times when, the brethren would say, okay, we want you to study home teaching. Figure out what's working, what's not working. Come up with some ideas. And so we would run pilot tests, or we would do studies, we would do member surveys, we would do all kinds of things to figure out what's really happening and then come back with suggestions.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd come back with what we thought were really good suggestions. And the brethren would look at it and study it and think about it and pray about it and say, well, it's a good idea, but the time isn't right.
Yeah. And those sort of those flashes of revelation that you maybe witness, right? Like obviously there's this, and you experience in local leadership too, sort of there's this broad leadership that by the time you're at the end of your time serving, you look back and you thought, wow, like look how God was involved in that. I didn't even realize it. But then there's those afternoons or the meeting where it's like, well, something shifted here. And that was cool to witness. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is. And to see, I had a whole file of good ideas whose time has not yet come. Is what I actually labeled that drawer.
And he will now read that file for us. No.
And sometimes even the brethren sometimes may not know why, but they may say, no, it's not quite the right time.
Yeah.
And as you look back on things, for example, I led the group that implemented the change from home teaching and visiting teaching to ministering, and that combined the elders quorum and the high priest group together. And those were ideas that had been thought about quite a while, had been studied, but it just wasn't the right time. And if you look back now at the sequence of events, there were certain things that had to be in place before that really, really made sense to do.
Yeah.
And the brethren study these things carefully and they figure it out, and there may be pieces of it that they know are the right things to do, but there's one other little piece that has to happen first. And that's where you see this gradual revelation happening.
Yeah. And so just using the home teaching experience, visiting teaching experience as an example, because I feel like in this church with such a long history and we're very, I don't know the best way to say it, but formalized church where, if the church creates a program, it's going out to the full church. It's not like, Africa's not doing this or, like everybody's doing it. Where some programs like home teaching, it sort of got to this point where it almost felt like it had gone stale. Now that wasn't necessarily the church's fault or could have been like every elders quorum's issue, but it was sort of like, all right, and all the jokes come and it just sort of becomes this thing we do, but we know we should do it, but we're not doing it. And ministering sort of helped us breathe new fresh air into that, right?
Breathe fresh air into it. Exactly.
Just from that home teaching journey, like how do you approach sort of those programs that feel a little stale from the church side of things?
Well, as employees, our job is to study it out and come with recommendations. Then the brethren look at those and they see a lot more than we see. And they look at it and say, is the time right? Is the sequencing right? Is there something else that needs to happen first? And they think about it and pray about it and receive guidance on what to do. Let me just give you quickly 2 quick examples. This one was about, 15 years ago or so. We were implementing one of the first church apps, mobile apps. And I sat in a meeting with the Quorum of the 12, and I sat, in the chairs behind the horseshoe table where the Quorum of the 12 sit, and some technology experts from the church's IT department were in there presenting the concept and seeking final approval on the budget and implementing this new app. And I remember Robert D. Hales, at the time he was in his 80s. He was not in great health. He was there in a wheelchair, had auxiliary oxygen, and I was sitting right behind him. And after the technology experts had given their presentation, I remember he raised his hand and he made a comment and suggested just a slightly alternative approach to the technological approach that they had presented. It was on the technology side. And they stopped and they thought about it and they said, yes, that's exactly what we need to do. Everyone in the room felt it at the same time.
Just settled. Yeah.
And there was this 80-year-old man that you would say, I don't know how much he knows about mobile apps and technology and so on, but he presented an alternative. He knew what the Lord wanted to have done, and he presented that. And the technology experts, I talked to him in the hall afterwards, and I said, I have no idea how he saw that perspective, and I don't have no idea how we missed that perspective. But this is one of the ways that the Lord guides his church. Sometimes people think, well, the brethren, they're old. They come from the previous generation. Do they really know what's going on? They do.
Yeah.
They really, really do.
Yeah, I believe it.
They get briefings every week. They have a regular meeting where they bring in experts in technology and sociology and legal issues, and they're presented with a lot of information, and then they have in-depth discussions about, well, how does this apply to the church?
Yeah.
What do we need to do as a church? They really are aware of what's going on in the world, and very, very much up to speed, and very, very much guided by the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard several stories just from different people. As far, even President Nelson has been a huge champion for technology and things that, and he texted early on before maybe people of his generation were texting and things like that. And so I think there's a lot going on that
these are very, very bright men.
Yeah.
Every one of them. As you look through every member of the 12 in the first presidency, you look at how the Lord prepared them before they were called to the callings they're in.
Yeah.
And it's not just about smarts. It's not just about experience. That they're humble and teachable, and they're guided by the Spirit all the time.
Yeah,
I'd seen it in and day out for 45 years that I was a church employee.
Yeah. Now, tell me just about, as far as with working with general authorities, you've touched on a few examples here, because we see, we're recording this day after April 2024 General Conference, and a handful of general authority 70s were released with emeritus status. We see new ones called. They walk up there, they sit in their nice red chair, and that's sort of all we see of it. And then maybe we'll see them come through our state conference here and there. But what comes to mind just with working with general authorities, how that works? So you have this group of church employees, like the salaried people that just, that's their job. And then you have general authorities who are also in that mix, but acting from representing keys and things like that, right? How would you describe it?
Yeah, exactly. So every church department has general authorities assigned as executive directors of those departments. And then all the church departments report to one of the councils of the church. There are three main councils: the Priesthood and Family Executive Council that I worked under most of the time, the Temple and Family History Executive Council, and the Missionary Executive Council. So each of those have 2 or 3 apostles on them. And
they have maybe some sisters from the Relief Society Presidency,
yes,
even though it may not
from
tie directly.
Organizations, and a member of the Presidency of the 70, and a member of the presiding bishopric. So that you get a good mix of people looking at issues from multiple perspectives. So you don't have, whether it's missionary or family history or priesthood work, you get this varied perspective.
Nice.
And so they counsel together on everything. So you get day-to-day direction from the executive directors assigned to your department. And then important things always go to that council, which gets even broader perspective before decisions are made, before things are done.
Any stories come to mind, or lessons learned, or moments that, just working with general authorities that have blessed your life?
It's an interesting balance, because they expect the church employees to do the homework, to come in with good proposals, to have thought it through, have carefully planned budgets and timelines and all those kinds of things. And then they look through it with ordained eyes as to, is this what the Lord wants done? This may be the way the world would do it, but is this the way the Lord's church ought to do it? And sometimes those things are adjusted. And sometimes they say, you haven't done enough homework. Think through this thing and this thing and this thing, and then come back with a better proposal. Or sometimes they say, great idea. Thank you for doing that. Time's not right yet. So put that in the drawer and maybe bring that back later when the time is right. But they also look at it so carefully and so lovingly, and that they're thinking and praying about it. I remember a meeting just a few years ago where they were setting up the guidelines for the FSY youth conferences. And they were so concerned that all youth would be able to attend. And youth in unique situations, how can we make sure everybody can come and it can work and everybody can feel comfortable? And they approached those guidelines so lovingly that it was obvious they wanted every single youth in the church to be able to come, no matter what was going on in their lives, no matter what the situation was. How can we structure this in a way that everybody can participate and be blessed by that? And I remember coming away from that thinking, wow, their level of love and concern to make sure everybody can be included was so far above what I had been thinking up to that point.
Yeah.
For example, it's impressive.
Yeah, because I would imagine as, in a general corporate setting, or you're an employee and it's like, I got a budget to deal with here. I just got to get this project to the end of the line. And so to have some of these perspectives just come up, realizing, it'll probably cost us more money, or it'll probably be more complicated. But this is, that's a leadership moment of like, this is really important that we make sure that this is available to all.
That it works for everybody.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's cool.
That's the level of love and support. That's the level of concern and thinking and prayer that goes into every one of the decisions that they make.
Yeah. Any other thoughts as far as working with general authorities, programs, things?
Well, just, again, they expect us to be the professionals. So there were a number of regular meetings with general authorities that I would conduct. We had a monthly meeting, for example, with the presidencies of all the organizations and our general authorities that led our department. And I worked hand in hand with Elder Kapishka on that. And he's an amazing man. He's so organized, and he and I would have discussions about, okay, well, how do we want these meetings to go? What do we want to accomplish from this? There's this fine balance between carefully scripting out a meeting with detailed agendas and follow-up items and decision points to be made. If you program it too tightly, we discovered, you stifle the Spirit. On the other hand, you can't have a meeting with 20 general authorities and general officers and just say, well, what do you want to talk about today? And so our task was to find what is that right balance.
Yeah.
How do you structure it in a way that effectively uses everyone's time, but at the same time gets input from everyone, and you're loose enough that the Spirit can guide and direct, and sometimes you don't accomplish the agenda that you thought up front you would have, but you also get to the things that need to be discussed, and you do it in a way that comes to a really good conclusion. So I think leaders in the church, same thing with, a ward council meeting or a youth council meeting. You've got executive secretaries and clerks that ought to keep track of follow-up items and agenda items and all that kind of thing. But you do it in a way that's balanced enough that the Spirit can guide. If things come up, you don't push them aside. Something that might have been more important to discuss than you had on the agenda, you've got to have enough breathing room that those things can come forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and that can be tricky at times when, in a ward council setting where it's like, all right, guys, let's get in this room. Let's get it done. I want to go home, or church is coming up. We got to get the kids ready. Or, that there's sort of this urgency at times, but to just let it breathe a little bit, or a topic, I remember as a bishop, a topic would be sort of discussed. I'm like, wow, like there's more passion in this room about this topic than I expected.
This is something we need to dig into somewhat, right?
Maybe we talk about it more here, or table it, or let's come back to this, because we can't just, make a decision to move on. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that fine balance. The Lord expects us to do all the professional work, but then he also expects us to be guided by the Spirit. And so I think finding that right balance is a key to leadership.
Yeah. You cover it pretty well as far as learning from general authorities. Anything we missed?
So much to learn from them.
They can be a whole
They're
podcast,
such amazing people.
Yeah.
And on my mission, we were able to work right closely with the area presidency, day in and day out. And it's just so inspiring.
Yeah.
To see how they work and to learn from them.
That's cool. Just tell me about like church initiatives that we see come up in just the processes. What thoughts or stories come to mind with implementing the initiatives that come through?
I've mentioned a few. when we moved from home teaching to visiting, home teaching and visiting teaching to ministering, one of our tasks was, how do we implement this change? Do we come up with something that's stark and different? Or do we, because change theory tells you, there's two extremes. One is you completely take away the old and you brand something brand new, and you go with that. And that can be a motivator for change because people see it as something new and fresh and exciting. On the other end of that is that you make incremental improvements. You don't really rock the boat, but you continually find some way to make incremental improvements. And so sometimes in the church, as well as in life, one will work better than the other. And I think for 50 years, they were trying to make incremental improvements in home and visiting teaching. And it pretty much, like you mentioned earlier, became stale a bit, became stagnant. People got in their minds that they would, make an appointment, show up at a house, read a lesson from the magazines, pray, and on the way out the door, you'd say, well, if there's anything I can ever do for you, give me a call. So as we discussed it with the brethren, they felt like, no, we need to make this major change. That's why President Nelson stood up and said, home and visiting teaching as we know it is now discontinued. Instead, what we're going to do is now move to this higher and holier way of ministering where you really, really care about somebody. You're not just a person that shows up at the door and gives cookies, but you're somebody's best friend that they can confide in and that you know well, and you're there for them. Yeah. And so they decided to go that way. And in fact, there was quite a discussion about what do we even call it. And I would say that President Nelson received a revelation that it should be called ministering. Of all the words we chose and all the background we studied, what these different terms, how would we translate them in 50 languages around the world? Will it make sense? Is there a common way that this would work around the world? And President Nelson came back and said, it's real easy. It's called ministering. Fits with the scriptures. And had some ideas on how to implement it, how to announce it. And
because we've been to like a block teaching was back in the day, and then home teaching, word teaching was now, right? So I think ministering is a good brand for that's for lack of a better term for that.
Well, and as you talked about ministering one-on-one to people's needs, and how the Savior ministered in all kinds of scriptures. Speak to that.
Let me ask you just about like the implementation of some new technologies and online things, because you were involved in that, right? With social media pages and blogs and things like that. What experiences come to mind?
Well, for a little while, I was responsible for LDS.org for about 5 years. I was the director of the website.
Wow.
Right when we made some major changes where it really went from pretty much static pages to database driven. We implemented a bunch of new technologies on the bottom end of it. We did a lot of study in terms of SEO, search engine optimization. How should we structure the pages? How do we title things? We put in place a lot of guidelines as to what the website ought to do, how it was organized, how you would write things, the underlying technologies. And that was a really fun experience. We got to learn a lot of things. And in fact, the church was recognized by some SEO experts, for example. And
cool.
We had some write-ups in magazines. Look what the Mormon church is doing. And look what's happened to their visibility in search engines and that sort of thing.
Oh, cool.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
A lot of fun. Facebook came along and the church was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we do and how do we? And I thought, we're going to miss the right name. At that point, LDS was what we wanted, facebook.com/LDS. So I registered the name real quick and we got in just before other people got it. And
Nice.
So it was fun being on the forefront of the social media.
Yeah.
It's interesting when a new technology comes along. And if you look back, you can see this from day one. that major inventions, and many of the prophets have spoken about this, major inventions in technology and in industry and other kinds of things, in travel, the invention of the airplane, that the Lord inspired all of these inventions to further his work.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what we can do today with the 12 traveling around the world. Every weekend they're on a plane flying somewhere. What if we didn't have planes?
Yeah.
Long
train
look
ride.
at the way technology helps the Lord's work move forward. When COVID happened, if we hadn't had Zoom and other technologies to have virtual meetings, what would have happened to the Lord's work? And we've learned a lot from that.
Yeah.
The church now provides ways that sacrament meetings can be virtually transmitted into the homes of people that health or other reasons don't allow them to attend in person.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting all the way through COVID, lots of the discussions of the brethren about how do we really make the Lord's work continue when we can't meet in person.
Mm-hmm.
And then what they learned from that also is, well, even after COVID now isn't a problem, there's still people with long-term illnesses or social anxieties or, that still can't come
mm-hmm.
and can't come back. And how do we provide for them? Similar to that discussion about FSY, they're so concerned about every individual and their situation. And is there a way we can accommodate that?
Yeah.
It's really a testimony to me that the great amount of love that our leaders have for us, and they're really just reflecting the love that God has for us.
Yeah.
Every one of us, no matter what our situation is. And we'll get into that some more when I want to talk to you about some of the life help things that the church has created.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about those years as far as the LDS 365, that you suddenly became this blogger, even though nobody really knew it was you behind the scenes for a while, right?
I didn't put my name on it for a long time.
What was the impetus of that?
There's this problem, which is a great problem to have. The church does a lot of stuff.
Uh-huh.
The church provides help and materials and resources and manuals and websites and social media accounts and so many things that there's this dichotomy of there's a lot to offer, but people can't use it if they don't know it exists.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if we were to tell everybody about every little thing, they would just be overwhelmed. So the brethren are really concerned that we don't overload leaders or even members with stuff, messages, programs, apps, whatever, from headquarters that gets in the way of local leaders and families.
Because there's additional pressure of like, oh, well, it's coming from the headquarters. I'm supposed to use it. Yeah.
So there are key things that the brethren want to make sure that we use.
Mm-hmm.
Scriptures.
Yeah, that's good.
That we have sacrament meeting. I mean, there's some core things in the church that need to happen. The church could exist without mobile apps, but some people find them very, very useful.
Yeah.
And in fact, huge time savers and amazing things. So on my own, I consulted with our department leadership and said, would it be okay on my own if I started a blog and started talking about some of these things? Because some people do want to know about every little thing the church does. Mm-hmm. And so I got permission from them to do it. So I started a blog. It was called LDS Media Talk. And then later I rebranded it to LDS 365. But that was 18 years ago. And I've written an article on the website every weekday since then.
Really? Wow.
About 4,600 articles, I think.
Holy cow.
Just saying, okay, there's been an update to this. There's been a new resource added to the website. Whatever that might be. New meetings coming up. A devotional this Sunday for young single adults. Whatever that might be. I just thought there's a group of members and leaders that would love to know about all of that. Mm-hmm. So
yeah. And you sort of had the inside ear on what was coming up, and so you could kind of get ready for it to put it out there. Yeah.
In a way, I mean, I never announced anything that wasn't already publicly announced, but it was just a forum to talk about more of the details, more of the minutia that some people might want to know about.
Mm-hmm. And you did that even through your recent mission?
I did. I've done it every weekday since.
Do you just sort of keep your eye out there as far as what's coming out on the Gospel Library app and things, and then just make sure it gets projected out there?
Every day I read the church news and the church's newsroom site and other communications that are going out, and just keep my ear to the ground so that I'm aware of those things. And just point out one new thing a day that those that are interested.
Are there some more than others that you wish more people knew about that they don't seem to hear, even though you write about it? What are some
Well, let me tell you about two of them.
Okay.
So one is a set of resources called Life Help. So if you go to the church website, into the Gospel Library, Life Help is one of the tiles. And there are some amazing resources about life challenges to give some good practical advice to people, whether they're going through depression or a divorce or LGBTQ issues or a death in the family, or just there's a list of like 25 different topics. And all of us at one point in our lives are going to go through one of those things. But to know there's a resource there that's gospel-based, that teaches the doctrine and then gives some practical principles to follow and even some practical advice about things to think about, or things to weigh in a decision about what I do in the middle of this challenge. There are just some amazing resources out there.
Yeah.
So things like, suicide prevention resources, all of those are in this section.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they range all the way from, divorce to suicide and everything else in between.
Yeah. And that it kind of, reflecting that with like the resources like a bishop that we have, right? And, sometimes generally bishops get criticized. Well, the bishop's not a therapist, but in my opinion, it's like, well, yeah, but in our faith experience, we have a person to go to and say, I just need help. Like, and then he has resources to connect them to. And the app is as well as like, it's a starting point. It's not like the Life Help section will solve all your problems, but it will give you a great place to start. Right?
Exactly. I was in a stake presidency and most of our bishops weren't even aware that Life Help existed. So the stake president said, Larry, make up a little card that we can hand out to the bishops. Yeah. If you need help with any of these kinds of things, go there.
Yeah. And that's the thing
and cards they could hand out to members to say, okay, you're going through this tough time. I don't know too much about it, but I know there's some church resources. Let me dig into it.
Yeah.
And you can go read some of these church resources too, and then let's meet back together again. Let's discuss it.
Yeah.
And that gives a bishop a chance to say, okay, well, what are the boundaries here? I am their spiritual leader, but can I give them some practical advice without pretending to be their therapist or something?
Exactly.
And
And to me, it takes a lot of that onus off the bishop, or that pressure they feel of like I've got to solve this person's problem for them and read that right scripture. Like, no, like point them towards these resources and say, let's meet in a little bit and talk about that. See what you learn, and I'll read, and we'll see what we can figure out. And it's beautiful.
Leaders often feel like they have to give an exact answer right on the spot, when often the right answer is, I really don't know. Let me pray about it. You think about it. Let's both go see what church resources there are, and let's go from there.
Yeah.
And
the Gospel Library app is so phenomenal. And even what the church history department has done with some resources, like in the history stuff, like you just spend your time and start poking around in there. You find some remarkable stuff that enhance your study or enhance your life experience that really make the gospel click and more applicable. So
two other gems in there that a lot of people don't know about. If you click on the tile that says topics, there's a list of, I think, 200 and something gospel topics. And some of them are as simple as faith or tithing and so on, that where you just learn a doctrinal perspective. But some of it is like same-sex attraction or about church history issues or events. All kinds of things to go there to answer questions. A lot of times we'll go to Google or AI nowadays, to find an answer to something. But we may look at resources that aren't reliable or that exaggerate the truth. There's so much information on the internet, and some of it is partially true, and some of it is just blatantly false.
Right. Yeah. And everything in between.
If I could say it that way. And so identifying reliable, trusted resources that you really can trust is really important.
Yeah.
You talk about, or you hear people say, well, I've gone out and I've done my research, which usually means I put the search term into Google and I clicked on the first 2 or 3 results.
Yeah. And
without really knowing what the sources were, what's reliable.
Yeah. Now in that topic section, that includes like you hear the blacks in the priesthood, like gospel topic essays, like those are all in there, but then there's like smaller resources for maybe more minor topics.
250 of them or something. Yeah.
And we've heard stories, especially early on with the gospel topics essays, where like even bishops didn't know where these came from, and suddenly a member was using them and he was uncomfortable. It was like, no, the church literally produced this. Like,
and again, back to your source of the gospel topics, they've all been reviewed by the brethren. They're all doctrinally sound. Yeah. They contain, all the best information that we have about church history events, for example. They're sources that you can rely on. Mm-hmm. So Life Help, gospel topics. There's a third one called My Calling.
Oh, yeah.
So if you click on Handbook and Instructions, if you're a new elders quorum president called, obviously you want to go to the general handbook and read the chapter about elders quorums. But right next to the handbook, the next tile over is a tile called Callings, and you can drill into that, elders quorum president, elders quorum secretary, and it will go into more detail about what your responsibilities are, give you links to resources, church apps and things that you might use in your calling, and answer lots of your questions.
Yeah, because I've noticed there, like for example, there's like in the handbook it talks about being a bishop, but then there's also additional callings that aren't in the general handbook or additional resources that maybe address how to be a bishop. Is that accurate?
Yep, okay, exactly.
And so you got to make sure you read all of those to get a good understanding of what's expected. Right? Yeah, that's awesome.
So when you call people to a calling, you obviously send them to the handbook, but you also suggest they click the tile right next to the handbook that might answer some of their more practical questions. Well, which meetings am I supposed to go to, and what handbooks, other handbooks or resources do I have access to? It just lays all that out in real short, very direct way. Yeah.
Now, talk to me a little bit about the handbook. And I think just in my time associating with the family and priesthood department, I think there's a few people that it's been suggested I interview, and hopefully I'll get them here, who specifically work on the handbook. But from my experience, and correct me, I'm going to make a broad statement here, and you can correct the nuances. But when I deal with local leaders or interact with local leaders, the feeling is like we've got to just hold on to the handbook, not let go, and any idea that deviates out of the handbook or isn't mentioned in the handbook is probably a bad idea. So let's avoid that. And then I work with interact with church employees or the priest department. They're like, man, I wish there's more local adaptation they took, with some of these things. So there's sort of this spectrum that people find themselves on. Sometimes they default so much to the handbook that they're like, if it's not, we're going to be so by the book that no inspiration's coming out of this experience. And then others that are maybe too loosey on the handbook experience. So what thoughts come to mind as far as leaders in the handbook and how to use it and things?
The handbook, the current version of the handbook is a whole lot less prescriptive than it used to be. Mm-hmm. The previous handbook used to get into a lot more detail.
There's actually 2 handbooks, right?
There were 2 handbooks. It wouldn't even fit in one publication. Yeah. The current handbook is so much shorter than the previous 2 handbooks, but it's also just a lot more doctrinal and principle based. The first few chapters, I would hope every member of the church, not just leaders, read, that sets up the purpose of the church, the purpose of families and the relationship there. And then it gets into some of the more specifics about how does the church run? How does a relief society, how is it organized? How does it run? And so on. But one thing that Elder Dubé, who was the area president in the Africa South area until just this conference yesterday, was announced that he was called into the presidency of the 70. He used to explain it to leaders this way. He'd say, you have total freedom within this box. And he said, now this box is bound on the one side by scriptures. It's bound by the general handbook, and it's bound by direction from your leaders. But within there, you've got total freedom. As long as the handbook doesn't tell you not to do something, as long as your leaders will approve it, as long as it's not in conflict with the scriptures, you've got freedom to organize it how you need to and do it how you need to.
Yeah.
So you can read through the handbook and you can see there's a lot of flexibility, a lot more than people think they really have. So, for example, in the handbook, it says, you call an organization president. And then if you have enough members and you need to, you can call counselors.
Yeah.
You don't have to staff every presidency with counselors and a secretary. And,
you don't need
in
it.
Small branches, you may not need that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of flexibility there. So as long as it doesn't go beyond what the handbook explains, beyond the scriptures, beyond your leaders, there's a lot more flexibility than leaders often think.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just see, well, my parents, or I've seen bishops do this in the past and assume a bishop has to do things a certain way.
Yeah.
Well, look in the handbook, and if it's not there, you've probably got some flexibility.
Yeah,
there.
because sometimes in that box that Elder Debate references, like sometimes the tradition is sometimes it comes in there and be like, well, we're going to bind you. Like, wait, where did you come from? Tradition,
That's
so
right.
And that's what going to the handbook and resetting. I remember starting in the stake presidency, ward conferences coming up, and we came together and said, we're going to pretend like we've never experienced a ward conference before, and go to the handbook and see what this would be, and we approached it all totally different. It was refreshing, but it was still in that box, and I think a lot of the bishops appreciated it. So, what else comes?
Well, you see that same pattern that we just described in the handbook, that it's very principle based, doctrinal based. If you look at the latest version of the For the Strength of Youth guide for youth. I mean, the previous versions, if you go back several years, it would describe, okay, this sort of clothing is appropriate, this sort of clothing is not appropriate. The new guide doesn't do that. It teaches you the principle of modesty, and then says, now you choose the clothing that you feel accomplishes what has been described here. Yeah. How we respect our bodies and so on. Instead of, well, skirts can only be so many inches above the knee, or, things like that. So in general, in the church, you'll see leaders teaching the doctrine and letting people govern themselves. We've heard that before.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. And we'll hear it again for sure.
That's right.
Now with the handbook, and this relates to your LDS 365 of updates and things, because they've had, like, the last few years, they had like every quarter or something, they would release sort of a chunk of updates. Yeah. But sometimes I'm in the handbook and I'm like, wait, did they change this? Or they notify everybody when they update the handbook, right? Because before they'd send out printed copies, so you'd be like, oh, I have the right version. But now it's like, it's in my app, but I think it was different yesterday. So how do updates
There's
happen?
a section right in the front of the handbook, and it will outline the updates that have been made.
Okay.
So recently. Yeah.
You have confidence that.
So you can refer to that section, and it'll explain what the updates were.
Nice.
But it's really nice that we don't have the printed copies, because, people would have handbooks from 30 years ago right. in the clerk's office, and that's what they would refer to.
Yeah.
Now it's no, go to the app. You've got the latest, greatest. That this is the current direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. Tell us, I'm just curious, since we have a few minutes left, as far as you just got back from South Africa on a mission there, you working with the area presidency. I mean, what was that experience like? What do you remember? What's the church like there?
It was an amazing experience. Ever since my wife and I got married, we said as soon as we retire, we want to go on a mission.
Yeah.
And so we did. And it was a great experience. Every couple in the church ought to go on a mission and serve together. Africa was a good experience for us. You would think that people who don't have, for example, you'd have routine blackouts 3 to 5 hours every day.
Oh, wow.
One day we went, I think, 18 hours with no electricity. Unemployment rate is 40%.
Oh, wow.
And among young adults, it's 70%. Many of the members will walk an hour to go to church. You would think that people that don't have as much as you have wouldn't be happy, but they're some of the happiest people in the world.
Wow.
We were just conference weekend yesterday. My wife saw some snippets between conference sessions of some African kids laughing and playing and jumping around, and she just almost started crying. She said, "I miss those little kids so much."
Yeah.
Sometimes they're blessed because we have so many complexities in life that sometimes get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
What I was impressed with the African people when we first got there was not just their humility, but their focus on the things that are most important. You know, people really aren't happy because of what they have or what they don't have. The gospel brings joy. And whether somebody has something or doesn't have something else, that doesn't necessarily stand in the way of their happiness.
Yeah.
And it helped them focus on the things that really matter the most. In their prayers and their testimonies, they talked about things that mattered. Thank you, God, for letting me be alive today and for the beautiful sunrise. And things that we just take for granted and don't even notice and don't even appreciate sometimes because we're so caught up in the busyness and the complexity of life.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So it was a refreshing thing from that way. There were a lot of things I learned from those great people there.
And then just give us perspective like how an area presidency works. That's usually a presidency of 3 70s, right? And they're just managing the church in that part of the world. Anything else you'd say to that?
That's right. They run all the ecclesiastical operations. And then there's a director for temporal affairs, a DTA, that handles all the physical things. So they handle church buildings and finances and purchasing and fleet and all of the, buildings and mission homes. And it's just amazing the complexity of the things that they have to deal with. But you've got an area presidency that's decentralized from headquarters. They report to a member of the 12, and they also have a reporting relationship to one of the presidents of the 70. But they run everything in the area.
So they're going out to state conferences and calling new state presidents or making sure that the missions are going well, or if the mission president has a question, they call them type of thing. Yeah. Wow.
And they set a direction for the area. Each new area presidency that comes in focuses on what they call the area vision. So in our area, for example, one of the goals that they had was to dramatically increase the number of young missionaries serving, because they saw that as key to growth in the area. So even though missionaries showed up in South Africa, in Cape Town in 1853, the church really didn't take off in South Africa until the revelation on the priesthood in 1978. And a lot of the members of the church there are first generation. So they haven't seen their parents and previous generations function in the church. Sometimes a bishop's only been a member of the church a couple of years, and so he doesn't really know what it means to be a bishop. And maybe he hasn't been in his profession blessed with something that has taught him leadership skills or organizational skills or interviewing skills, those kinds of things. And so sometimes they really struggle with what they need. And so the idea was, if we can get more young people out on missions teach a lot about the doctrine of the church, but they also see the church in action, and they learn leadership skills through their whole mission experience. So if we can get more young people on missions, we're blessing the next generation with all these marvelous leadership skills. So their goal was to double the number of missionaries, and they did it within a year.
Wow. That's awesome.
They really, here again, we talked about tradition. Some of the leaders there, as they're counseling young people going on a mission, have you been saving up for your mission? And in the economic situation, maybe their parents don't even have a job. How much are they supposed to save up for a mission? So the area presidency went back to Doctrine and Covenants, section 4. Do you have a desire? Are you worthy? And you've been a member of the church for at least a year. Those are the 3 requirements. Everything else will take care of itself. And there was just this huge push, and doubled the number of missionaries. That's cool. It's going to make a huge difference.
Larry, last question I have for you. As you look back on your time, both as a leader, as a, working for the church, but as a leader, and as a lay leader in the church, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
That's a good question. I don't think any leader can truly lead if they're not willing to do the things themselves that they ask others to do. You can only fake it so long when somebody sees you as a leader of, well, you're not really doing that yourself, or you wouldn't be willing to do what you're asking me to do. People will see through that. But more importantly than that, a leader's got to lead with the Spirit. I mean, you've got to be in a position that you're bringing people along with you, not just trying to push them to somewhere you've never been yourself. So in the church, we'll go back and forth between being a leader and a follower. We may be a bishop one day, but then the next week we're teaching a class or we're doing something else and we're following other leaders. And that's by design.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You ask me what else I'd learned from the general authorities that you see. They'll be in a position one day where they're the president and they have other people as counselors, and then they're given a different assignment where they're now a follower. And they may now be a counselor to somebody that they used to be a president over. And there's there's no jockeying for position. There's no feeling that one assignment is less than another assignment. And the same thing at the local level. Like I say, somebody's a stake president one day and the next day they're in the nursery, or they don't even have a calling, for a while. I think we've got to be willing, and that's part of the humility of being a follower of Christ, is you do what you're asked, and you may have one assignment one day that's a leadership position, and the next day you have another assignment where you're a follower. And we've got to be willing to do that. Doesn't matter where we serve, that the Lord knows our heart, and that's what matters.